Thank you for being here. I want to make this not as much me talking as me showing you examples of what I try to do in the book. You can't really, we don't have a DVD with the book, so I'm going to try to give you sort of the DVD version of the book if we'd been able to do that. So I want to show you, instead of telling you, as I do in the book, about how I think this ad changed American politics, I want to show you how I think it changed American politics. So I'm not going to go into too much of the intrigue behind the spot, except we can certainly touch on that as if you want to talk about that in a minute. But I want to demonstrate why I think this ad and this campaign that Lyndon Johnson ran in 1964 was not historic just because he won a tremendous landslide victory and the impact that it had on American history and American politics, because it was Lyndon Johnson and not Barry Goldwater in the White House, but because of the way that this Daisy Girl spot and these spots that ran during the months of October and November, or September and October of 1964, how they actually transformed American politics, or at least the way that politicians communicated with voters in campaigns, how it changed the way that they motivated voters or persuaded voters, how that it literally changed the nature of the conversation between politicians and the public. So to understand that, you have to spend a little bit of time looking at the way that conversation occurred, the way that politicians communicated with voters before 1964. And there are two important things to remember about that, or to know about that. Is first, politicians generally didn't, well, I'm actually going to throw three in here, but politicians generally didn't advertise the way we think they advertise today. In other words, it was not very common for a politician to buy a 15, 30, or 60-second spot within a television show and air that spot. Eisenhower did it in 1952 with a series of spots called Eisenhower Answers America, and I'll show you a few of those in just a minute. But other than a few brief episodes in each campaign in 50, 52, and 56, and 1960, politicians generally looked at advertising as abbreviated versions of their campaign speeches. So in other words, instead of creating a flight of spots and putting all kinds of money into television, mostly the candidates still advertised on radio in those days, but instead the television advertising were 15-minute and 30-minute blocks of time in which the candidate would just get up and give a speech, or give an abbreviated version of usually his speech. And those speeches, they had no real production quality. It was just them standing in front of the camera, maybe with some halfway interesting background, maybe a bookcase, or sitting on the edge of a desk. I'll show you a spot of Richard Nixon doing that. And what spots they did use and the speeches themselves were very rational, fact-based appeals. They generally didn't use emotional appeals. They generally didn't think of what images can I show to motivate the audience or reinforce my message or demonstrate my message. Now, I'm not saying they never did that, but generally they did not. And if you go to some of these websites, one called the Living Room Candidate, they'll show you a lot of spots from 1952 and 56 and 60, and the ones they show you are the most interesting ones. They're the ones that use some of that production, that have some production quality to them. But the problem with that is it sort of distorts the way people look at those campaigns, because it leads you to believe that they just ran these spots, when in fact they didn't really run those spots. They put very little money behind those spots. They generally ran, as I said, 30-minute blocks of time. And the problem with these websites is they're not going to load up a 30-minute video. They're going to load up a 30-second spot. And so it distorts the way we remember these campaigns. We think of them as running spots all the way, and they didn't. Number two is they generally didn't have relationships with their advertising agencies the way that advertising agencies, who really are now political consultants who do only politics, they didn't have the kind of relationships where a candidate today would contract with someone and say, hey, I'm going to run for president, I'm going to run for governor or Congress or city council or mayor or whatever, and here's what I believe, and here we've done some polling. Now go produce spots for me. And the political consultant, having worked on hundreds of campaigns before and having created all kinds of messages for candidates, would come back and say, okay, here are my ideas of what we're going to do, and here's some creative ways to promote you and to attack our opponent and all of this. In those days, it was the candidate telling someone working for, who was basically just a person who took instructions from the campaign. They didn't think of themselves as being the creator of the advertising. They'd relied on the campaign or the party to tell them, okay, here's how we're going to characterize our campaign. Here's how we're going to advertise. Here's what we want to do. You go, just do it. You produce it. But the ideas, the creative ideas, came from the candidates themselves in most cases. Not in all, but in most cases. So this is the sort of the world that existed up to 1964 largely. So I want to show you a few of these spots that demonstrate sort of how boring and drab political advertising was in those days. And here's one from 1952 for Adlai Stevenson, who was running against Dwight Eisenhower.
I'm excited about voting for Governor Stevenson for president. I think he is a new kind of man in American politics. He will be a president for all the people. Stevenson has told the Texans and the people of Louisiana and California that tideland oil belongs not to them alone, but to all of the people of the country. In the South, he has made a strong statement for civil liberties and full equality. The farmer, the businessman, the veteran, and the working man, to each in turn, he has said that he will represent not their interests alone, but the interests of all of us. That's why I am excited about Governor Stevenson. He will be a president for all the people.
Exciting, huh? She's very excited about voting for Governor Stevenson. All right, so that sort of tells you not only how great the production quality was, but also just there was nothing in there except very sort of rational, fact-based appeal to nothing to appeal to the emotion. No image at all except this woman sitting in front of this very amateurish ballot representation. Okay, so now let's jump ahead to 1960 when things really hadn't changed too much. I'm going to show you some one from Richard Nixon, who's a little more interesting, but not much more interesting than what Stevenson had done a few years earlier.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon.
I want to talk to you for a moment about civil rights, equal rights for all our citizens. Why must we vigorously defend them? First, because it is right and just. And second, because we cannot compete successfully with communism if we fail to utilize completely the minds and energies of all of our citizens. And third, the whole world is watching us. When we fail to grant equality to all, that makes news, bad news for America all over the world. Now, the record shows there's been more progress in civil rights in the past 8 years than in the preceding 80 years, because this administration has insisted on making progress. And I want to continue and speed up that progress. I want to help build a better America for all Americans.
Okay, so see that just nothing really fancy about that. Just looking into the camera and making a very rational, fact-based appeal. All right, now I want to jump ahead to, jump over to John F. Kennedy, who actually tried to do something a little more interesting, but really not much better. And you'll see how amateurish this Kennedy spot is from 1960.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair?
We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you cast your vote for Kennedy, and the change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, it's Kennedy, 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 for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy,
The thing I love about that is that Kennedy had, we all know Kennedy had a little money on his hands, and yet whoever they hired to do that actually was cutting the stuff out and pasting it on poster board and filming it. I mean, so it was still very amateurish, although I give him an A for effort. Okay, so then let's jump ahead to 1964. And Barry Goldwater is the nominee of the Republican Party running against Lyndon Johnson. The Republicans, God bless them, had still not caught up to really caught up to this. And so here's a sort of a typical Goldwater spot from that campaign.
On at least 7 occasions, Senator Barry Goldwater said that he would change the present Social Security system. But even his running mate, William Miller, admits that Senator Goldwater's voluntary plan would destroy your Social Security. President Johnson is working to strengthen Social Security. Vote for him on November 3rd.
Now, you know how the Democrats answered that slogan? In your guts, you know he's nuts. So I teach this to my students sometimes. You got to be careful. You got to sort of try out your slogan and try and experiment with how the other side might distort it. They also said, in your heart, you know he might. And that gets me to what the Goldwater's problem here and the opportunity that it gave to Lyndon Johnson and the people who are advertising for him. Goldwater, as you may recall, had made a few indiscreet comments about nuclear war and nuclear weapons. He had written a book published in the early 1960s called Conscience of a Conservative, still in print, still read by a lot of people who want to study the birth of the modern conservative movement. And in that book, Goldwater talked a lot about how we ought not to fear war with the Soviet Union, challenging the march of communism across Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the world. And particularly, we ought to use the advantage that we had in nuclear superiority, and that we ought not to fear using nuclear weapons. In fact, he generally called those who were more careful or more circumspect about the use of nuclear weapons. He essentially called them cowards. We're cowardly in our approach to the Soviet Union when we're not willing to say we would use these nuclear weapons. A legitimate debate, clearly. We had these weapons. Presumably we had them because we thought we might need to use them someday. So it wasn't an illegitimate debate, but it is what it is. And it may not have been so bad for Goldwater had he left it at that. Had he left it just in that sort of academic discussion in a book that he didn't even write, by the way, that was written for him by a guy named Brent Bozell, and he barely edited the book before he sent it off to the publisher. But he persisted in making a lot of off the cuff comments and littering his speeches, and in some off the record, what he thought were off the record comments to reporters about nuclear warfare, nuclear weapons, testing of nuclear weapons, including after Kennedy announced that we would try to send a man to the moon. He said, "I'm not so interested in sending a man to the moon. I want to lob a missile into the men's room of the Kremlin." A joke. He didn't really mean he wanted to bomb the Kremlin, but that's what he said. He did speculate that maybe one way to deal with the war in Vietnam was that we drop some, we use nuclear weapons to defoliate the forests and reveal the communist supply lines from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. He voted against the nuclear test ban treaty and was very much in favor of continued nuclear testing. And in a minute, I'll show you how the Johnson campaign used that against him. He also was on record as saying that he thought that NATO commanders in the field in Europe ought to have unilateral ability to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons, that they shouldn't have to call the White House to ask for permission to fire off a nuclear weapon if they were under attack. Again, it was in Goldwater's defense, there was some legitimate debate about whether that was wise or not, but it is what it is. We had that debate, and he was on record with that position. And you may recall his famous line in July 1964, at the Republican convention in San Francisco, when he got up there and said that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And so he spent a lot of time and effort sort of painting himself as an extremist, especially when it came to nuclear war. And I'm not even getting into his position on the TVA and Social Security and civil rights and all of that. But on nuclear weapons, he painted himself as an extremist and then embraced the label. And so simultaneously, Lyndon Johnson had hired a real ad firm, Doyle Dane Bernbach, still in business, considered one of the greatest legendary ad firms. They did the famous Volkswagen ads, some of you may remember from the 1960s, and John F. Kennedy had seen these ads and said, I want that firm to do my campaign. And so they started the negotiations with DDB. Kennedy died, and the relationship persisted, and they ended up hiring DDB to do Johnson's campaign. These were a bunch of people who were, first of all, they were true believers. It was a sort of the ad firm created a sort of a firm within a firm, got all the sort of the loyal Democrats of the firm, people who really were either very worried about Goldwater or very loyal to Johnson, and they volunteered to work on this account. And they were given almost complete editorial and creative control over the campaign. They were not told by the DNC, by the White House, here's what we want you to do. In fact, there was a meeting in which Johnson had with Bill Bernbach, one of the principal of the firm, and when Johnson started telling him about how he ought to do some ads, Bernbach stopped him. Bernbach was famous for treating clients roughly, shall we say, and said, Mr. President, you know, your job it's my job to tell you what to say, not your job. And Johnson amazingly just said, okay. I mean, I've studied and written a lot about Johnson. It's amazing that he got away with that. But Johnson said, okay, you know, I trust you. I trust you. Your reputation is so good that I trust you. And so Johnson let these people go to work. And so they had a lot to work with. And they decided to do something that was truly revolutionary. And this is why I think that these spots changed American politics, because they said we are not going to give our audience information. Our audience already has information. Our audience already knows everything they need to know about Barry Goldwater. They know everything they need to go. We don't need to tell them any more about Barry Goldwater. What we need to do is take what they already know and what they already feel about Barry Goldwater and put it to use. We need to put that to use. And we need to put it to use in a way that brings the emotions out. They don't need more information. They need context for the information they have in a way that creates an emotional response. And so on the night of September 7th, 1964, in the middle of Monday night at the movies on NBC, David and Bathsheba, at about 9:50, these are what the 50 million viewers watching that show saw.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Okay, so they showed that thing one time. They never showed it again. They showed it one time. That was it. The only time they paid $25,000 to show it. They showed one time. 50 million people saw it that night. And later that week, all three networks showed it on their newscasts. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It was in newspapers around the country talking. It was the subject of editorial cartoons, and people knew about this spot. And so people ask me why they only run it one time. Well, here's the way another way to look at that. I think conservatively 100 million people saw it in 1964. That is about 80% of the electorate. That is an amazing penetration. You would pay millions to get those kind of numbers, not just the numbers, but the percentages. You would pay millions to get that. So they really didn't need to show it another time to get the kind of audience that you would need to show it 20 times today to get that, or more to get that number. But there's another reason they didn't show it, is because, frankly, they had something better. And this was just the first punch of a series of punches that they were going to throw against Goldwater over successive weeks. So the whole nation has seen this. People are talking around about the water cooler, and it doesn't run again. And they're thinking, what's next? What's coming next? And this is what came next. The same night of the following week.
Do you know what people used to do? They used to explode atomic bombs in the air. Now, children should have lots of vitamin A and calcium, but they shouldn't have any strontium-90 or cesium-137. These things come from atomic bombs, and they're radioactive. They can make you die. Do you know what people finally did? They got together and signed a nuclear test ban treaty, and then the radioactive poison started to go away. But now, there's a man who wants to be President of the United States, and he doesn't like this treaty. He fought against it. He even voted against it. He wants to go on testing more bombs. His name is Barry Goldwater, and if he's elected, they might start testing all over again.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So now another 50 million people have seen this, and the clear message is what? Barry Goldwater is going to kill your child if he's elected president. He's going to your child will either die in a nuclear explosion or will be poisoned by the ice cream that she eats. So here's what happened in successive weeks. This spot only ran once, and then by the way, Goldwater had also made a comment that the bomb is just the nuclear bomb is just merely another weapon, and this is how the creative forces at DDB use that.
On October 24th, 1963, Barry Goldwater said of the nuclear bomb, merely another weapon. Merely another weapon. Vote for President Johnson. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Okay, and then to me, this is the most amazing one. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but it lasts 4 minutes, and it's primarily about the test ban treaty, but it's a pretty arresting sight.
The following is a pre-recorded, paid political announcement.
We will have to have everyone inside the blockhouse. Otherwise, you'll have to go down to the roadblock. Stand by.
In July of 1945, the United States tested the first atomic bomb.
20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
In September of 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb.
12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Six, 5, 4, 3,
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Okay, you get the idea. Pretty subtle stuff. And then I'll show you the final spot that they showed on this subject, one in which has been repeated most recently in 2008, run by Hillary Clinton against Barack Obama.
This particular phone only rings in a serious crisis. Keep it in the hands of a man who's proven himself responsible. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Okay, a couple more spots I want to show you that demonstrate that it wasn't all about nuclear weaponry, but they did make effective and very creative use of Goldwater's statements.
In a Saturday Evening Post article dated August 31st, 1963, Barry Goldwater said, "Sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea." Can a man who makes statements like this be expected to serve all the people justly and fairly? Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So that gives you an idea. DDB did 27 spots for Johnson during that campaign. Some better, some not as good. But by and large, they were using these creative principles of advertising that they were applying to other products, other clients they were working for. But they were also, in many cases, not trying to tell you something. But as I mentioned earlier, they were trying to use the information or the emotions that you already had and put them to use with images that were unforgettable. I mean, the sawing off of the eastern seaboard. I mean, how brilliant but simple is that? So that is how I think that spot and those spots changed American politics. And if you want any proof, any further proof, go to the website, The Living Room Candidate. Look at the spots from 1960. Look at the spots from 1964 of Barry Goldwater, Frozen in Time, Lyndon Johnson, New Era of Political Advertising, and then look at the spots from 1968, and you'll see that both parties had adopted those principles. Both parties had hired professional ad firms and were now producing high-quality stuff, effective stuff. Now, this may beg the question, is this a positive development for American politics? Did this actually improve the dialogue? I mean, we'll have to leave that for another day, but I think it's undeniable that it fundamentally changed the way that politicians talk to us and communicate with us and exploit our emotions, particularly the emotion of fear.